Hey, this is just a quick note about our sponsor, Privado, the premier enterprise privacy platform, purpose-built to bridge the gap between privacy and engineering. Its privacy code scanning solution embeds privacy compliance and governance into the product development lifecycle and empowers privacy and security teams with unparalleled visibility of sensitive data flows and the insights to find and fix privacy vulnerabilities. You can leverage Privado's data flows, dynamic data mapping, privacy assessment automation, and real-time visibility of privacy issues. Enter the era of proactive privacy and transform privacy from business blocker to business enabler. To learn more, go to privado.ai.
In privacy, we need to understand that we're providing a service to the rest of the organization, and we are leading by example, and we are serving others through our leadership and through our advocation. Just understanding that maybe you're not going to see the rewards every single day. Take time for yourself, make sure that you understand that you are hopefully fighting the just fight, but really being a servant leader and uplifting others to enable them to do kind of privacy on your behalf. That's how we kind of leave the best legacy and continue to grow adoption and education of privacy.
Hello, I am Deborah J. Farber. Welcome to the Shifting Privacy Left podcast, where we talk about embedding privacy by design and default into the engineering function to prevent privacy harms to humans and to prevent dystopia. Each week, we'll bring you unique discussions with global privacy technologists and innovators working at the bleeding edge of privacy research and emerging technologies, standards, business models, and ecosystems. Welcome, everyone, to the Shifting Privacy Left podcast. I'm your host and resident privacy guru, Deborah J. Farber. Today, I'm delighted to welcome my next guest, Jake Ottenwalder, Principal Privacy Engineer at Integrative Privacy, a consulting firm that he launched, which centers around a holistic approach to privacy implementation. Jake, having moved from a cybersecurity background into privacy, has been a one-man privacy engineering team across late-stage startup organizations, most recently GoFundMe. He also worked at Deloitte for quite some time and has a lot of consulting experience. Jake lives outside of Seattle, Washington, where he's raising a puppy and creating model landscapes in his spare time. And today, if you can't tell, we're going to be chatting about implementation of privacy objectives into the business and engineering and what that takes. Welcome, Jake.
Hey, Deborah. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. To start off, why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey from security engineer to privacy engineer and what motivated you to switch your focus and why focus on privacy program implementation?
In college, I kind of focused on cybersecurity. My university had an honors program dedicated to cybersecurity, and I was really interested in kind of going down that route. Got my first job doing cybersecurity consulting with Deloitte, and throughout that experience, started to learn more and just understand more about data. And when I got the opportunity to leave that organization, I started doing more just compliance automation. And part of the compliance that I was automating was privacy. So I moved a couple more times and slowly got strictly into privacy and absolutely love just the abstract nature of the industry, how we have regulations, but there's a lot of connection between regulations and technology and ethics. And I think it's a problem that nobody's going to be able to solve, but I love the opportunity to just be able to add my name into the hat of hopefully people who can affect change and improve privacy around the world.
That is a very noble goal. So I'm glad that you were able to be delighted by privacy and the wicked problem that it is and trying to, streamline some things. So you talked about it being pretty abstract. And loving that. Why don't you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that's been a real pain point for a lot of folks, especially engineers, where it's so abstract. You just don't have like the appropriate requirements to test to know that you've met a privacy goal or aim. And so that abstraction has been a double-edged sword in many ways. Got this principle-based privacy right or privacy principle that you want to make sure is embedded into the business. But then you're like, well, what does that really mean when there's no like set of requirements. How do you get from point A to point B? How do you take the abstraction and actually get to requirements?
I'm going to tell a little embarrassing story, but in college, I was sitting there after college and looking for a job, and I was sitting there and I was like, I don't understand how everybody has to work so much. Like, how can problems be so hard that you can't just solve it in a couple hours? and I was sitting there as this naive college kid, like not believing that problems could really be that hard as I just kind of coasted through college, and I was fortunate enough to like not have to worry a lot about finishing homework like taking a long time to do homework and stuff. So I was coming from this mindset of just like, how can problems be so difficult? And yeah, abstraction and privacy is huge, but I love it because it's such a unique experience or unique perspective that everybody has on it, right? So like every individual person has what they believe their privacy should be respected for, or what they believe their data is valued at. And as a privacy engineer, as somebody who's looking at the regulations, a lot of times the regulations don't go far enough, or we look at the regulations and we say it's telling us this thing, but what's the essence behind this regulation? Like, what's the purpose of trying to get consent? And like, does that mean that we just put up a banner that says accept all, or does it mean that we give people like equal choices and stuff? So there's a lot of that level of abstraction, and that almost I want to say like advocating for everyone equally, that really became like a big motivator for me. And so I guess to answer your question, how do you get that into kind of requirements? It's really hard. It takes a certain mindset. It takes a mindset of like always being ready to like constantly learn and being open to new experiences and talking to people. And it takes a very kind of global mindset that I try to consider individuals who are unique in their populations and require the additional support that we should be giving everybody, no matter where they're coming from.
That makes a lot of sense. In fact, that actually inspires another question for me of, security is very much system focused, right? And so when we talk about compliance of a system, we're talking about, is it secured according to, requirements? But it really takes a mental shift to then be like, no, privacy is about people. It's about protecting people from harms. And then obligations on the compliance part is around, obligations of protecting that data in a certain way that's linkable to a person. And so how has that mind shift been for you to make as you moved from security into privacy? Because it's clear that you have made that mind shift, even just talking about giving people choices instead of just putting a banner up there to say you have compliance, right? Or really thinking about the people in the population and maybe some edge cases and who could be harmed by this. And so I guess maybe partly my asking this is also wanting to understand and educate others on how you've made that leap and maybe how they can then like get security folks to start thinking in this way, even if they remain in the security function, but just expansive understanding of what privacy means.
Yeah. First thing that kind of comes to mind is taking a second to look around at everything going on and really understanding, or I think there was an article and it's off, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it talked about, for some reason, a different character or customer profiles. I think there's a lot of studies around like customer profiles and stuff, or I think there's different like data. I think it's actually related to privacy specifically, maybe. But looking at just the broad range of like people's experiences and just thinking about that. And then for me, having the opportunity to work on systems where I was working with billions of connected devices, or GoFundMe is a massive platform that I was super honored to work on that requires so much support, and just looking at like different people's whose stories and who are really needing help gives you that perspective that you're there to like kind of serve. The biggest thing for me is that it's not my data, right? As an organization, they're collecting information, but it's not really their data. They're borrowing it from other people. And so just like as I would borrow my lawnmower from a neighbor, like they would probably expect it back like at some point. So this is all data that organizations are borrowing. And so as stewards of the data, we need to be respectful of those people's wishes. So I think security plus ethics to me, like the security area is like you said, a lot more straightforward. They have a lot more compliance. As you add in this ethics, then you get to kind of privacy. And so people who are interested should look into more ethical considerations and just understanding like debate really, really complicated stuff. Like what is free will? Like, do you have free will if you have bring up cookie banners again, but they're one of the most challenging UI conversations and issues are around consent notices as well. It's like, do you have free will if you don't have the expectation or if the UI is pushing you in a different direction? And so how can we really allow people to be more free with those decisions? And that's the area of privacy that I love to play in, have conversations in, and try to push an organization to adopt what I consider to be the more ethical kind of approach.
So it sounds like some of the reasons that you've been able to really make that switch is you actually were working for a company that had a real good focus on B2C, right? So you weren't just a B2B business that's trying to figure out the privacy stuff and like thinking about privacy rights being a compliance obligation. And so just like, what's the best way to achieve compliance in a privacy perspective? But you're really like had to actually like your personas within your organization, like a major one was individuals that were going to just fund some startups and those individuals' data that you were collecting. And so you were kind of seeing part of that need to protect a person as opposed to just B2B flows. Does that resonate with you? Do you think that that's some of the reason?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'll even go back a little further because I first started to really explore privacy when I was working at Axon. Axon's the company that has developed the tasers and body cameras, and they have a very large market in that. When you look at privacy considerations for a company that develops like policing technologies, all the privacy concerns around that were huge. And looking at like video camera data and audio recordings and looking at tracking of police activity or where people are going, like that really obviously like you see that being like you see body camera images like released online or publicly released and how all of that affects privacy as well. So definitely like that was the first, like you're seeing people kind of dealing with that. And then my other organizations definitely had a lot of like individual, like, yes, these are real people that are going to be interacting with these sites and these web apps that are like we're having like billions of devices and millions of people a month that are touching these things that we need to not only so that it's implemented consistently, but also like robust for all of the people that we're servicing.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's turn to the topic of the day, like implementing privacy into an organization. You claim to take a holistic approach to privacy implementation through your organization, Integrated Privacy. Now, what does it mean to, first of all, to implement privacy? And then tell us about your holistic approach to implementing privacy.
Yeah, I think just implementing privacy is like something that a lot of organizations just try to do. And I think they start off by putting in a cookie banner with OneTrust is like the big, everybody uses that platform, or just creating a privacy notice and sticking that up on the page and calling it a day. That's where I see a lot of organizations like using it. And you'd be surprised, the even larger organizations, as they continue to grow, still maintain those as kind of the foundations of their privacy program, just a page on their website and this little banner that'll pop up for certain people. I took a lot of thought in trying to figure out what my next steps were after leaving GoFundMe, and I really felt like there's an opportunity for people to adopt and have better relationship with privacy within organizations. And so for me, that kind of came in through this mind of like integrative privacy being similar to like an integrative wellness. I find, or I'm a believer of integrative wellness and just understanding kind of your body as a whole. And I take that similar approach when looking at integrative privacy and implementing privacy or privacy technologies. It's not just a checkbox. It's not just the compliance. It's the ethics, it's the people of the organization that need to be educated and brought into the fold to be enabled to be better data stewards of people's information. And so that's kind of where I take this integrative and more of a holistic approach to privacy implementation.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hello, loyal listeners. The Shifting Privacy Left podcast is seeking sponsors who want to help educate our growing community of privacy engineers. Position your brand in front of privacy engineers, architects, developers, researchers, and privacy tech buyers. Insert a 30 to 60 second ad like this one into every published episode of the podcast. This is dynamic content after all. Feature your new product, an upcoming conference, a sponsored special deal, endless opportunities. Email sponsorship@shiftingprivacyleft.com for more information on our sponsorship package. Okay, let's get back to our engaging privacy conversation. Thank you. That's helpful. Let's talk about metrics for success. How do you define a successful implementation, and what makes for I guess a bad implementation or not as successful?
Yeah, I think implementations are always such a challenge, and it is privacy technology is this area, and I think where these privacy engineers have so much, I give them so much respect, and because they have to deal with implementations that are so unique to the tech stack that they have to work with, but also have to be forward looking and be ready to scale or change with regulations that are coming out, and also be able to accept or look at each individual person that's coming to the page and give them options for their privacy. So for me, a successful implementation really starts with this adoption of the technology, looking at how it can be best integrated into the entire kind of stack. And I think a lot of successful implementations are on the backs of strong understanding of what data is in your company and where that data is going. And I think if you have that understanding, you can implement kind of privacy technology much easier and have a much better foundation for that. Bad implementations, I think everybody has an experience with this. It's when there's always something that's kind of popping up. I think a lot of it comes down to planning and scoping, making sure that you can take a second, and I just want to get in and do stuff. I want to do cool stuff. I want to fix things, but you got to take a beat at the beginning and look at the landscape and look at the picture of what you're trying to do. And if you don't do that, then you're going to have surprises that come up. You're going to have issues with scoping or planning or resources that just can prolong this implementation. And it's a lot about building that trust for the organization, because privacy is not really a money-making operation. If you're doing successful implementations and you're on time and on spec, you're going to have a lot more trust with the organization when the next tool kind of comes into play that you need to work on.
Yeah, I also think of that as if you're just trying to do the minimum necessary and just comply with a new regulation, instead of looking at the broader trend of what that regulation is trying to solve for, oh, okay, we can still do this with all our data, but a new regulation comes in and says, well, I don't know, we need to be careful about location data and the way that's used and whatever. And you're just doing pointed solutions around one data type, and you're not seeing the broader effort to get your arms around how data could be used, misused, the harms around it, and then each time a regulation comes, you're constantly going to have to re-implement something else rather than thinking about what is good privacy. Because if you just think, what is good privacy and what does it look like to respect that, and let's now try to automate for that, then if you do that, compliance will follow. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
It'll be easy to make simple tweaks based on new regulations.
Yeah, exactly. That's why you run the podcast, Deborah. You hit it right on the head. That's exactly. If you're kind of continuing to do these Band-Aid solutions, you're going to always be behind the 8 ball. If you look at what's the right thing, and this is where the ethics kind of come in. What's the right thing to do? What's the right thing for our customers? What And sometimes you might get those things wrong, but as long as you're kind of shooting for that, you're going to get a lot further than just kind of playing whack-a-mole, so to speak. So
Awesome. What are some consequences that you've seen for badly implementing privacy? Obviously, I kind of talked about that you're constantly playing catch up and in a state of frenzy of trying to like be compliant when you're only addressing it in short bursts of compliance projects as opposed to privacy comprehensively integrated in. But what are some other consequences that you've seen for attempts at implementing privacy, but like that are done wrong or done efficiently or effectively?
yeah, I feel like the biggest issue with badly implementing privacy or one of the consequences is you end up having a lot of stuff just like lost or a lot of skeletons in the closet. You gain kind of a lot of tech debt is kind of the term that I hear a lot of people using,
Oh, yeah.
where it's like you're implementing something and you have engineers kind of working on stuff, but you're continuing to kind of dig a hole for yourself. And that is just really expensive to get out of.
It's expensive to get out of. And I will even throw in there, as someone who's been doing operational privacy for 18 years, that the more tech debt there is, the more I, as a I'm technical oriented, but I'm not hands-on applied technologist, right? So the less ability I feel I can make change in the organization, right? So the less desire I have to even take a job in that company. Those are downstream problems, I think, that need to be thought about when you talk about this tech debt, because it's like, you're just making it harder and harder for me to be able to solve the problem by not addressing it. So I don't want the job. It's just not going to set me up for success or the company.
I consider tech debt is obviously a lot of like the technical stuff. Also, we got to talk about like the procedures around that. Everything that you do in privacy, or I consider everything that I'm doing to be setting a precedent, right? So like, whether it's you're implementing a tool and it's halfway done, that is setting a precedent of like, it is that way now, right? And so it takes a lot more effort.
Like it didn't meet the MVP almost of the deployment.
Yeah.
It's like it's not even meeting the minimum viable requirements of the need. Is that kind of what you're saying?
So like, even if you're like implementing a technology or that's like out of date, the processes that you're putting around it, or as you kind of continue to grow as an organization, there's the technology that might be out of date or lacking behind or not up to compliance. And then there's also the procedures associated to that, which are all precedents that also require a lot of effort to start to change and work on as well. So I think it's both of those that we have to deal with privacy engineering, not only the technology, but also the processes that we need to update and modify.
Got it. So building on that, how would you summarize what it takes to achieve a successful implementation of privacy?
I think starting off, I mentioned it's the strong kind of foundation. I think understanding the data that you're working with and where the data is going. And there are tools that kind of can do that. I think it requires a lot of education and driving awareness by like the privacy team. Like I said, there are tools that will help you look at data discovery. It's why do we need this? What is the benefit of it? And how else are we going to get this value if not doing this? And so it really starts with that strong foundation. And then it takes a lot of planning. And for me, it's been a lot of like project management work as well, and growing in my skills around project management to be able to talk with an engineering team and understand the technology behind it and help them implement and develop the software, but then also communicate high-level goals, high-level needs, and escalate that to be able to get the resources and get the support that I need. So I think that's in essence, and we're distilling down a lot of information. So that's what I would kind of say is a successful implementation is focusing on those kind of key areas.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to kind of talk about some of the challenges that I've faced when I've wanted to help implement privacy into an organization. I want to know everything that's going on in that organization around privacy. But sometimes that's, I want to do this so that I can maybe piggyback on some other projects and just add privacy requirements. That way it's like, you're not recreating the wheel. You can leverage efficiencies. There's so many good reasons to do that. But sometimes, especially in engineering heavy scaling tech companies, and I'm pulling from my own experience at Amazon, but it could be any of the large big tech or just giant enterprises, or just any engineering focused heavy org that is moving fast and, not necessarily like waiting for you to put guardrails around. You just can't know everything that's going on. I was working for, at Amazon, 1.5 million people work there now. Like there was no way. I was finding out about consent decrees and fines that I had no idea about because I wasn't part of legal. And when you're in a giant it's decentralized security and privacy within those orgs. So you might be within one business unit and you have no idea what other business units are doing. And it's not for a lack of partnerships or wanting to know. It's just too big to get your arms around all of the moving pieces. That was very frustrating for me because I wanted to know. And in order for me, I've learned a lot about my ADHD in recent years about like divergent mindset is I need to know, have a high level understanding of everything going on. And I also need to go deep into the silos of the components of that to have understanding of any one of those components. It's like, in order for me to have that big picture. And so without that, it's a little disorienting because you don't know all the things going on. When working in an organization to implement privacy, how do you stay on top of everything that's going on in an organization related to personal data?
You mentioned working at Amazon. I mean, I feel like these challenges are very similar to the work that I've done as well, where I was like I said, a one solo team kind of privacy engineer with 300 software developers like in the organization and trying to understand what all the sprints are doing and what people are kind of going on. And I'll give you a little virtual high five for I also have some attention challenges as well. So maybe it runs in our line of work, but also.
Well, and for me, I find that I'm paying attention to too many things, right? Like it's not a lack of attention. Everything is coming in and not getting so I'm filtering it all out, not out, but I'm making sense of it all instead of just like maybe 3 things. I'm seeing like 10, right? And so it's just more overwhelming. But I still feel I need to get that info so that I can better have a mental map about the state of things.
Totally, because if I don't have all of that information, I feel like I'm going to make the wrong privacy recommendation. Because because for me, when I look at privacy or doing PIAs, it's very much this like interconnected system. I might be doing a PIA for an authentication system, but that authentication system is going to inherit that risk from other kind of services as well, or pass their risk along. So everything is connected, and I looked at it at that granular level. First, I'll say like mental health is super important. And I think to your point, with a lot of stuff happening all the time around privacy, it does take me a lot of time to be able to like sit with my thoughts and process it. And unfortunately, my mind kind of races at night and I just need to kind of lay there and process stuff out or write things down that's going through my brain. And it does take a toll. And so I definitely think mental health has been a huge topic in the workforce. And I think it bears the same kind of power here as well. For me, focusing on like how to stay on top of things, I think there's a lot of power in enabling and getting close or just enjoying and trying to befriend the people that you work with and just trying to get access to roadmaps and looking at stuff from like a high level. I think the more that you can work with other people and have other people like really enjoy working with you who are in the positions that are on the different engineering teams, or you can get access to what their roadmap looks like or sit in on a monthly kind of meeting just to let your like ear perk up if anything new kind of happens. That's how I've been working on it. And it's a job that, and even for me, when I was one person with 300 engineers, not to mention what you had to deal with like an Amazon sized organization, even just enabling other people to kind of help support you in that. It's not something you can do on your own, but it is, in my opinion, very valuable, like we said, to be able to recommend the right kind of privacy steps.
Yeah, that's true. And it has me even thinking that I guess it makes, you definitely want to have those relationships and people to almost keep an eye out on certain things for you. Like, hey, if you ever come across this where they're starting to collect a lot more data elements linked to this person, give me a call. Because I want to track down what that is and like the goals there. Or if you sniff out that there's going to be there's new systems being deployed and I didn't, it hasn't been well communicated, like let me know, or this way I can do a DPIA if there's high risk or whatever it is that the job role is. Obviously not everyone's doing DPIAs.
Yeah, keeping alerts on like Confluence pages is something I've done before. Like a new kind of page is added in Confluence, just have that sent to my email. I'll wake up, I'll have 100 emails, but I'll just kind of look through that pretty quickly and be able to say, okay, like that makes sense. I mean, it feels bad, but I don't want to say go spy on the rest of the organization, but it helps to just kind of see and just understand what's going on. And I think as long as you do it and again, create those relationships, build the confidence and trust with other people that you talk to. Like I have great friends from outside of the engineering or within other engineering teams that I rely on today and get to talk to. And it's nice to also just have people at work that you can enjoy talking with. So yeah, those are some of my tips as well.
Well, thank you for that. So let's start with anonymization. What are some of the blockers that you've seen when deploying anonymization as a privacy control within Works?
Yeah, anonymization is a very sensitive topic for a lot of people because I think there's no clear consensus, at least from a legal perspective or from a risk and compliance perspective, like how to really prove data is anonymous. And so there's a lot of, I feel like the consensus around anonymizing data is very hard to really define. And so the biggest blocker that I've had with deploying anonymization is the early stages of like getting people to buy in on like trying to do masking. And I think to reach anonymization, you kind of have to start with basic kind of masking of data. And then you move into like, okay, we're going to start to transform the data a little bit into this pseudonymized kind of state. And then you reach, or the hope would be to eventually reach or have some data sets reach this standard of anonymization. So it's a very long kind of process. And so just getting the buy-in is generally a pretty big blocker that I've had because organizations, again, are focused on the money. And so if you can't show them what the dollar signs are that, or the risk that's associated to not having anonymized data, when not a lot of companies have been fined for classifying their data as anonymous when it's not, it's really hard to start to prove and get that to be adopted.
So I think maybe it's the framing, because when I think of anonymizing data, I think of it as one of the big ways you can take data that you have for one purpose and then be able to use it for a secondary purpose freely because it's no longer personal data once it's anonymized. So like a lot of the times this is great for opening up the value of data for analytics purposes and insights and all that. So I kind of see this happening a lot in the data science space where you want to anonymize certain things, but then where it's a challenge is that if you're anonymizing, it depends on if you're anonymous, it's input privacy or output privacy, right? Is it anonymizing before you do the analytics so that you can freely do that? Or is it doing the analytics and then anonymizing the output before sharing it with third parties? I guess there's different use cases, but I kind of see anonymization as being used more around how do you open up and use more and get more value out of the data set, and that really being tied well to, additional revenue as opposed to compliance, so take you out of like potential risk of having personal data.
I definitely agree. And that's the general push. And I think a lot of people can achieve like what is considered more of a pseudonymized state through that. And the leap between pseudonymization and anonymization is pretty big, in my opinion. When we look at pseudonymized data, we can very much just take the data set as its own entity and ask, like, is this table able to connect you like back to a specific individual like on its own? And generally that's a lot easier to achieve than anonymized data and taking the definition from like GDPR. And there's a lot of regulations and legal conversations from Germany as well that I've studied. Anonymization is does there exist a data set that could or that would re-identify this individual? And from a computational analytics perspective, does it exist is a much more difficult question to prove that it's not. And so I think a lot of companies are accepting the risk of like not being able to fully prove anonymization, but just again, accepting that risk as there's not been a lot of regulation in the space or not been a lot of fines in the space. And so that's where I see the position at. And I know there's contingents on both sides of this privacy industry of people who believe anonymization is possible and others who don't believe it's possible. Generally, like for your example of use cases around like data analytics, there are ways that we can aggregate or manipulate data to what I would still consider maybe not fully anonymized, but it would be very well masked or very well pseudonymized so that you can still do additional analytics or secondary use on it, but it's very hard to like fully reach that, what I would say like a purist kind of anonymized state would be.
Yeah, so I think there's also a difference, I think, when we talk about anonymization versus anonymized data set versus like you could have a data set that you want to make anonymous for release, right? So when it's released, nobody can actually, outside of the organization itself, it's pseudonymous data, it exists pseudonymously, but it would be for shared purposes. It's anonymous for what has been, like no one can link it back other than the company that actually has the identifiers or capability to link it back. So technically, one would say the data set is a pseudonymous data set because it can be re-identified. But for the purposes that it was released, that are not that data that nobody else can re-identify it, right? And I feel like we need better vernacular around those distinctions because I think those distinctions are there differences with importance that we just kind of lump anonymization in as whereas it depends on whose perspective you're looking at. Like from a company that just sees statistics that I wouldn't be able to figure out who contributed what data to that, anonymous data set, but that those that do hold the keys might be able to re-identify it. And so for their purposes, it's pseudonymous, but for my purposes, it's anonymous, right? And so yeah. I think that gets a little confusing. I'm also curious, what do you think about, differential privacy and using differential privacy techniques to achieve anonymity? And that, it's a very high bar under GDPR to have data be considered anonymous. But I do see a lot of people talking about differential privacy as one way to get there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've done kind of statistical analysis around differential privacy, like actually implementing it and stuff, which I think I was very privileged to be able to kind of do that. And it is a very interesting and kind of like hopeful space. And when I looked at like how to do anonymous data well, the biggest thing that I think everybody kind of agrees upon is there has to be some like uncertainty in the data. And it's unfortunate, but like the more uncertainty that we add to the data, technically the less like valuable it becomes, right? So there's always going to be this trade-off of like, you could have a perfectly anonymous table of ones and zeros. Those are the only values that are there, but it won't be very valuable. Differential privacy kind of helps add some of those elements to it. But I would caution by saying, like, just because you implement differential privacy doesn't mean you're going to reach a state of anonymization, because differential privacy still has some limitations. You could have if you're using an epsilon value that's too high, you could inadvertently, or that's not really privacy preserving anymore. And I know some organizations have like very high epsilon values, but they still say we're using differential privacy. Well, you're kind of ruining the technology if you just have an epsilon of like 100 when a normal value would be like 1. That gets like exponentially worse.
So do you think what would make that better? Would having a formalized standard that people like can claim that they met the requirements of a differentially private standard? Like epsilon must be under this, otherwise, auditability of that, like to make it so that anyone who claims that differential privacy techniques must and compliance with that is claiming that they're meeting certain epsilon values and privacy budgets and stuff.
Yeah, that would be great. And I know there are like conversations, or I think differential privacy works really well when you're looking at like a point in time kind of, and you're looking at a privacy budget for like a point in time query, right? If you're trying to pull statistics once and you kind of need that, it doesn't work if you're trying to, like, to your point, release a data set that is, or not that it doesn't work, but it becomes a little bit more risky when you're trying to release a data set that's going to exist for a long period of time, because anonymization is not a like one and done thing. It's an ongoing assessment that needs to like constantly be reviewed, because new data sets could come out that could re-identify it like tomorrow. Like Facebook could like open up a new API that gives a bunch more data that would allow us to re-identify some data that they had previously released. So it's a constant kind of review. And I do know of some organizations and startups, I'm not paid to mention their names, so I won't, but there are startups who are trying to like develop, they do an analysis of your data, they give you masking techniques, and then they partner with organizations and legal firms who would sign off on like, us as a legal firm are willing to say that this meets our standard of anonymization. That gives organizations a little bit more kind of comfort.
That also tracks. That's very similar to kind of what was going on in the HIPAA world for a long time. We all agree
exactly.
de-identification standard is no longer, even though it's still in law, is no longer like good, and it's not anonymous. It's not necessarily meeting all the kind of the need for the moment. But there always was this kind of use case where, or requirement under HIPAA, that you would have a statistician that you would hire to certify that your data set under HIPAA, was impossible to re-identify, or there's like ridiculously low likelihood of the ability to re-identify. And so I'm not surprised that I did not know this, but I'm not surprised that this is now becoming a little bit of a expansive beyond HIPAA. And now you can have tools and techniques from data scientists that can work with the attorneys or whatnot to actually like provide rigor around the process of ensuring that it can't be re-identified.
Yeah, and it puts me as a privacy engineer in an interesting position, because if I'm taking, and I'll self-proclaim that I take more of a purist view of anonymized data from GDPR, and looking at like, in a lot of cases, I don't think fully anonymized data can exist, because I think, like I said, it's a ongoing living process that it might be anonymized right now, but it might not be anonymized in a couple months from now.
Right.
And so as somebody, as a privacy engineer, if somebody else is willing to accept that risk, sometimes I need to take a step back and say, okay, if this organization is willing to say that this is anonymous, even if I'm going to do my best to protect it as well as I can, and even if I don't think it reaches anonymization standards, you have to sometimes allow other people to accept that risk for you. And I do hope in the future that we get to a point where, like you said, we have a standard around what an epsilon value could be, or we look at like the PCI compliance with the security world was a very largely industry-driven standard that was developed. And maybe that, I think privacy is following a lot of the trends that security has been maturing through. And maybe that's something in the cards that we're hopefully going to see pretty soon.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks for sharing your perspective on that. Let's now turn our attention to consent management. What are some of the current blockers to implementing consent management capabilities into organizations?
I think a lot of privacy engineers or people who are trying to implement privacy within the organization would say the main blocker around consent management is the organization, like just this need for everyone to collect and consume data. We want to understand what people are doing, understand their experiences on our website, understand all the tracking and things going on. And with consent management, we have to take a step back and look at what is the purpose behind our platform, and what should we be doing like as part of our functionality, and what should we make sure that customers might not be expecting that we're doing, and that we ask them if that's all right. So I think the major blocker, again, is the shift in mindset around like being data stewards and understanding that data has risk, and being willing to let people make decisions on their own, and taking a hit sometimes from a business perspective to continue to kind of build that trust.
Got it. That makes sense. So what are some holistic approaches that you would suggest to implement consent management platforms and other features that enable compliance while supporting marketing and advertising goals?
I think from a holistic perspective, I look at, again, meeting kind of the marketing and advertising teams where they are, understanding kind of what their flows are and understanding like how can I integrate and how can I integrate my privacy checks, or how can I enable them to be better data stewards and understand like when do I need to get tapped on the shoulder to answer a question, or just kind of building that relationship. So focusing on kind of where those marketing teams are at to support the adoption of like better advertising technologies, or understanding like where we need redundancy, or if we need multiple platforms and how that makes it challenging to look at like data flows. And I think understanding, again, with consent is very widespread. It should populate through a lot of the different data flows and interconnections that the organization works on. So working with data teams to make sure that that's a key functionality, a key centerpiece in how they look at data and what information they're allowed to process.
Makes sense. And then last but not least for today, we'll talk about what are some of the current blockers to implementing rights management capabilities, through DSAR processing into organizations. For instance, processing data access and deletion, not just the request, but then like the delivery of them, right?
Yeah, this is an area that's probably one of like the biggest challenges that a lot of organizations have that maybe they don't know, because data is so, again, like a very living thing within your organization that you could delete it in one spot and then it might repopulate there or might trickle down from another location. So understanding where your data is flowing and the data lineage has been a really interesting area that I think a lot of data analytics platforms are focused on now, like data lineage and customer trajectory. We have to look at the same thing with privacy. Like, where is the data flowing through? If we delete the data in this one location, is this the like starting point of the flow, or is this kind of near the end? And how can we continue to go through those flows? And the biggest area that I think is still a challenge for a lot of functions and areas or vendors are like being able to audit these data like deletions as well. Like, how can we prove that we've done something that we've said we've done? And how much proof are we able to kind of provide as well? I think those are all pretty big challenges. And then you get into like legal concerns around deleting data and having to like have those conversations and have back and forth around like, do we really need all of this information, or are there ways that we can know your customer KYC with like financial data with less information? Or how can we separate out our data flows so that we have legal data in one cold storage and all of the other data that we're maintaining in more of an active state that can be deleted more easily? A lot of stuff that takes a lot of thought and forethought and conversations within an organization, that without that, you're going to implement a tool that is just going to, again, have lack of adoption, not fully cover the organization. And it's a lot, in my opinion, it's a lot worse to say we're doing this and find out that you're not doing it, versus saying we're consistently building to improve our program.
Yeah. And so are you seeing that as like companies are adopting like tools, data discovery, mapping, and DSAR delivery tools and such? They're implementing the tools without maybe processes first defined as to how those tools will be used? Or is it more, or what are some holistic approaches to implementing a streamlined, compliant, DSAR process that has minimal disruption to the business?
Yeah, it starts with, again, like kind of understanding the processes of the business and understanding kind of where the data is going. A lot of organizations that I've seen are going to go to like the bells and whistles companies in privacy technology, and they're going to go ahead and purchase like the best tool, but then they're going to sit there and not know what to do with it, or they're going to connect it to a couple systems and think they're done.
Right.
It takes somebody who's done it before, or has kind of this mind and understanding that You have to look at every system. Hopefully IT has a list of systems. If not, you have to build a system inventory, and then you have to go through and understand like how are people logging into the system? Because if people are logging in through Okta, then or some other service, then SSO service, you have to make sure that you're deleting there, or do you have to delete accounts on the application itself? It's about like who's accessing the system, what they're doing. Is it a personal account or is it a business account? Like, for instance, if you're a recruiter for a company and somebody says delete my data, that recruiter should technically go into their LinkedIn profile because they were acting as an agent of the company and delete their messages with that recruit if they no longer want to have their data collected by the organization. That's like a massive edge case that I believe should be part of a DSAR process.
It makes sense. I mean, really, like LinkedIn, it just becomes an extension of your CRM. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so that's there's no API that's going to kind of do that. And you can't there's no way to kind of do that without it being a manual process. So really, I think DSARs are this stopgap. And this is going to be my hot take for the episode. But I think DSARs are not the best solution when it comes to deleting or trying to worry about data. I think we should take more of an approach connected to like marketing emails or email addresses that if somebody doesn't respond or interact with your platform over a certain period of time, that data should just automatically be deleted.
Yeah, data minimization and just, the principles of just keeping data accurate and up to date and all of those things. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I think a lot of DSAR processes are just being utilized by the people who know that they're being utilized, right? Or know that they exist. And I would tend to say that would be people who are more highly educated about just privacy in general. And so we look at, is it a discriminatory practice against people who might not be as well educated? And I, as somebody working in privacy, believe that everybody in privacy should be a human right. So how can we make DSARs a process that everybody's aware of, that everybody can participate in, even if they don't have the technical background or understanding to be able to do that?
I think that's really great advice. Do you have any words of wisdom to leave the audience with today?
Yeah, hopefully my voice wasn't too annoying to the rest of the audience.
You have a great microphone you're using. You sound wonderful.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time, Deborah, and you having inviting me onto the podcast. The last kind of word that I would like to say, or just my final thought, would be around this concept of being like a servant leader. I think in privacy, we need to understand that we're providing a service to the rest of the organization, and we are leading by example, and we are serving others through our leadership and through our advocation. Just understanding that maybe you're not going to see the rewards every single day. Take time for yourself. Make sure that you understand that you are hopefully fighting the just fight, but really being a servant leader and uplifting others to enable them to do kind of privacy on your behalf. That's how we kind of leave the best legacy and continue to grow adoption and education of privacy.
That is great advice. Thank you, Jake, for your servant leadership here and for sharing your wisdom with the larger audience. So, Jake, thank you so much for joining us today on the Shifting Privacy Left podcast. Until next Tuesday, everyone, when we'll be back with engaging content and another great guest or guests. Thanks for joining us this week on Shifting Privacy Left. Make sure to visit our website, shiftingprivacyleft.com, where you can subscribe to updates so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found this episode valuable, go ahead and share it with a friend. And if you're an engineer who cares passionately about privacy, check out Privado, the developer-friendly privacy platform and sponsor of this show. To learn more, go to privado.ai. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode. Bye for now.